In the spring of 1857, 17 members of the Patterson family vanished from their sprawling estate in Millbrook Valley, Pennsylvania. No bodies were ever found. No ransom demands were made. No witnesses came forward. The local sheriff closed the case after just 3 weeks, citing probable Indian raids despite the complete absence of evidence. For over 160 years, the Patterson disappearance remained one of America's most baffling unsolved mysteries, until now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Recently discovered documents hidden beneath the floorboards of the old Millbrook Presbyterian Church reveal a conspiracy so twisted, so calculated, and so thoroughly buried by those in power that it makes the Salem witch trials look like a Sunday school disagreement. What happened to the Patterson family in the months leading up to their disappearance will change everything you thought you knew about small-town America in the 1850s. The year 1857 found Millbrook Valley caught between two worlds. The Industrial Revolution was transforming eastern Pennsylvania with coal mines and steel mills, but this remote valley nestled in the Allegheny foothills remained stubbornly agricultural. Rolling green pastures stretched between ancient oak groves, and the Clearwater Creek meandered through farmland that had been tilled by the same families for 3 generations. The valley held barely 800 souls, most of them descendants of Scottish and Irish immigrants who had arrived in the 1700s seeking cheap land and religious freedom. Whitewashed farmhouses dotted the landscape like scattered pearls, their split-rail fences marking boundaries that had remained unchanged since the Revolution. The single dirt road connecting Millbrook to the outside world wound treacherously through mountain passes that became impassable during winter storms, leaving the community isolated for months at a time. At the heart of this pastoral paradise sat the Patterson estate, a magnificent 3-story manor house built from local fieldstone and imported timber. Malcolm Patterson had constructed the mansion in 1832, after striking it rich in the California gold rush. Unlike his neighbors who scraped by on subsistence farming, Malcolm had returned from the West Coast with enough wealth to purchase nearly 2,000 acres of prime valley land and establish himself as the region's unofficial patriarch. The Patterson family tree included Malcolm's wife Eleanor, a refined woman from Philadelphia society who had shocked her family by marrying a rough-hewn prospector. Their 6 children ranged in age from 28-year-old Duncan, who managed the family's extensive grain operations, to 12-year-old little Margaret, whose laughter could be heard echoing across the valley on quiet summer evenings. The extended family included Eleanor's elderly mother, several unmarried aunts, and a collection of cousins who had gravitated to the Patterson wealth like moths to a flame. But the Pattersons were more than just the valley's wealthiest residents. Malcolm had used his fortune to become the community's primary benefactor, funding the construction of Millbrook's first proper school, donating the land for the Presbyterian Church, and providing low-interest loans to struggling farmers during bad harvests. His wife Eleanor organized charitable societies, taught Sunday school, and served as the unofficial social coordinator for every wedding, funeral, and harvest celebration in the valley. The family's influence extended far beyond their wealth. Duncan Patterson served as the volunteer fire chief and led the local militia unit that had been organized in response to growing tensions over slavery. His younger brother Thomas managed the valley's only general store, extending credit to families who couldn't pay cash and somehow always finding extra supplies for widows and orphans during harsh winters. Even the youngest Patterson children were beloved figures, known for their generous spirits and willingness to help neighbors with everything from barn raisings to livestock roundups. Yet prosperity in 1850s America was never without its complications, especially in a region where old ethnic rivalries simmered beneath the surface of Christian charity. The original Scottish settlers who had founded Millbrook viewed themselves as the valley's natural aristocracy. Families like the MacLeods and the Camerons, whose ancestors had fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. They had grudgingly accepted Malcolm Patterson's rise to prominence, but they never forgot that his wealth came from California gold rather than inherited land. The Irish families who had arrived during the potato famine of the 1840s occupied a more precarious position in the valley's social hierarchy. The O'Briens, the Kellys, and the Murphys worked as tenant farmers and day laborers, grateful for employment, but increasingly resentful of their subordinate status. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They attended separate Catholic services led by a circuit-riding priest who visited monthly, and their children learned their letters in makeshift schools that couldn't compete with the fine education available to Protestant youngsters. Religious divisions cut particularly deep in a community where theological differences were seen as matters of eternal significance. The Presbyterian Church dominated the valley's spiritual life, its stern Calvinist doctrine providing comfort to families who believed that hard work and moral rectitude would be rewarded both in this life and the next. But the growing Catholic population brought different traditions, different loyalties, and different ideas about the relationship between church and state. Political tensions added another layer of complexity to the valley's social fabric. Pennsylvania remained officially neutral on the slavery question, but Millbrook Valley found itself increasingly divided between abolitionists, who saw human bondage as a moral abomination, and conservatives who worried that rapid social change would destroy the stability they had worked so hard to build. The Underground Railroad had established several safe houses in the region, and runaway slaves occasionally appeared in the valley seeking food, shelter, and guidance toward Canada. Malcolm Patterson had emerged as one of the area's most prominent abolitionists, using his wealth and influence to support anti-slavery candidates and provide financial assistance to fleeing slaves. His mansion had served as a station on the Underground Railroad since 1853, with a hidden room in the cellar that could shelter up to a dozen fugitives at a time. Eleanor Patterson organized fundraising dinners for abolition societies and corresponded regularly with prominent anti-slavery activists in Philadelphia and New York, but the family's political activism had created powerful enemies both within the valley and beyond its borders. Southern plantation owners had placed bounties on prominent Underground Railroad conductors, and federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act had begun investigating suspected safe houses throughout Pennsylvania. Local pro-slavery sympathizers, led by wealthy landowner Jeremiah Blackwood, viewed the Pattersons as dangerous radicals whose activities threatened to bring federal scrutiny and possible military intervention to their peaceful valley. Jeremiah Blackwood represented everything the Patterson family was not. Where Malcolm had earned his fortune through individual enterprise and luck, Blackwood had inherited his wealth from a grandfather who had profited from the slave trade before Pennsylvania abolished the institution. Where the Pattersons used their influence to lift up their neighbors, Blackwood employed his resources to maintain rigid social hierarchies that kept certain families permanently dependent on his largesse. The Blackwood estate rivaled the Patterson mansion in size and grandeur, but its atmosphere was entirely different. Blackwood Hall, as locals called it, sat behind high stone walls topped with iron spikes, its windows heavily curtained and its grounds patrolled by armed guards who questioned anyone approaching without explicit invitation. Jeremiah Blackwood himself was a gaunt, pale man in his late 50s, known for his expensive clothes, his educated speech, and his ability to hold grudges for decades. The rivalry between the two families had been simmering for years before it finally erupted into open conflict. The immediate cause was a disputed land purchase involving a strategic piece of property along Clearwater Creek that controlled access to several important mill sites. Malcolm Patterson had offered to buy the land from elderly farmer Samuel Morrison, who needed money to pay mounting debts. But Jeremiah Blackwood had simultaneously approached Morrison with a competing offer, one that included certain unstated, but clearly threatening conditions about what might happen to farmers who chose the wrong business partners. When Morrison ultimately sold to Patterson, Blackwood's response was swift and vicious. He called in loans he had extended to several Catholic families, forcing them to choose between bankruptcy and accepting employment as his personal enforcers. He spread rumors about Patterson family members, suggesting that their abolitionist activities were actually cover for criminal enterprises involving smuggling and tax evasion. Most dangerously, he began corresponding with federal authorities, providing detailed reports about suspected Underground Railroad activities in Millbrook Valley. The situation deteriorated further when Duncan Patterson announced his engagement to Sarah McKenna, daughter of one of the Valley's most prominent Irish Catholic families. The marriage would unite Protestant wealth with Catholic ambition, creating a powerful alliance that could challenge the traditional Anglo-Scottish dominance of local politics. Conservative families viewed the engagement as a betrayal of proper social order, while progressive residents saw it as a hopeful sign of growing tolerance and cooperation. Jeremiah Blackwood saw it as an opportunity. If he could somehow prevent the marriage, or better yet, use it to destroy both families' reputations, he would eliminate his primary rivals and establish himself as the Valley's undisputed leader. The plan he developed over the winter months of 1856 was breathtakingly audacious in its scope and chilling in its ruthlessness. Working through intermediaries, Blackwood began recruiting allies from among the Valley's most disaffected residents. Economic hard times had left several families desperate for any source of additional income, and Blackwood's gold could purchase loyalty even from those who might ordinarily have supported the Pattersons. He also reached out to external allies, including federal marshals eager to break up underground railroad networks and political operatives from the Know-Nothing Party, who specialized in exploiting ethnic and religious tensions. The conspiracy that emerged from these clandestine meetings would make use of every social division, every personal grievance, and every institutional weakness in Millbrook Valley's small community. It would transform neighbors into informants, ministers into propagandists, and law enforcement officials into accomplices. Most terrifyingly, it would demonstrate how quickly a peaceful community could be turned into a killing ground when fear and greed were skillfully manipulated by those who understood the darkest impulses of human nature. By the early months of 1857, Jeremiah Blackwood had assembled what amounted to a shadow government in Millbrook Valley, complete with its own intelligence network, its own enforcers, and its own carefully crafted narrative about the dangers posed by the Patterson family and their Catholic allies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would begin with whispered accusations and end with 17 people disappearing without a trace, their fate hidden for more than a century and a half by those who profited from their destruction. First sign of trouble came on a fog-shrouded morning in early March 1857, when Father Michael O'Sullivan failed to arrive for his monthly visit to Millbrook Valley. The Irish Catholic families had been expecting their circuit riding priests since dawn, gathering at the McKenna farmhouse where services were traditionally held. By noon, when the priest still hadn't appeared, Patrick McKenna sent his eldest son riding toward Pittsburgh to investigate. Young Timothy McKenna returned 3 days later with news that chilled the Catholic community to its core. Father O'Sullivan had been found dead in his room at a boarding house 20 miles east of the valley, apparently from a heart attack that had struck him in his sleep. But the circumstances surrounding his death raised troubling questions. The priest had been a vigorous man of 42 with no history of health problems, and witnesses reported seeing him in animated conversation with 2 well-dressed strangers on the evening before his death. More disturbing still were the items missing from Father O'Sullivan's belongings. His personal Bible, which contained detailed notes about every family he served, had vanished along with his correspondence and his carefully maintained records of baptisms, marriages, and confessions. Someone had clearly searched his room after his death, taking anything that might provide information about his flock in Millbrook Valley. The priest's death sent ripples of fear and suspicion through the valley's Catholic population. Without their spiritual leader, they felt exposed and vulnerable, particularly given the growing tensions between Protestant and Catholic families. Sarah McKenna, Duncan Patterson's fiancée, confided to her mother that she had been receiving anonymous letters warning her against marrying outside her faith, messages that grew increasingly threatening as the wedding date approached. But it was the arrival of 2 federal marshals in late March that truly shattered the valley's peaceful facade. Marshal William Garrett and his deputy, a cold-eyed man named Joseph Finn, rode into Millbrook claiming to investigate reports of underground railroad activity in the region. They took rooms at the valley's only inn and began conducting what they called routine interviews with prominent residents. The marshals' methods were anything but routine. They questioned families separately, asking detailed questions about their neighbors' activities, their political beliefs, and their financial resources. They examined property records, church attendance logs, and even school enrollment documents, building comprehensive profiles of every family in the valley. Most ominously, they paid particular attention to the Patterson estate, spending hours documenting its layout, its outbuildings, and the comings and goings of its residents. Malcolm Patterson initially cooperated with the investigation, confident that his legal activities couldn't be challenged by federal authorities. He provided tours of his property, answered questions about his political views, and even allowed the marshals to examine his business records. But his attitude changed when he discovered that Marshal Garrett had been meeting privately with Jeremiah Blackwood, sessions that lasted well into the night and involved the exchange of what appeared to be substantial sums of money. The breakthrough in understanding the marshal's true purpose came from an unexpected source. Anna Mueller, a German immigrant who worked as a seamstress for several valley families, overheard a conversation between the 2 federal agents while delivering mended clothing to their inn. Hidden behind a laundry basket, she listened as they discussed their real mission, which had nothing to do with enforcing fugitive slave laws and everything to do with eliminating the Patterson family's influence in the region. According to Anna's account, Marshal Garrett had been hired by a consortium of powerful interests that viewed Malcolm Patterson's abolitionist activities as a threat to their long-term economic goals. The Underground Railroad network disrupted the profitable business of slave catching, while Patterson's financial support for anti-slavery politicians threatened to shift the balance of power in Pennsylvania's legislature. The marshals had been sent to manufacture evidence of serious federal crimes that would justify confiscating Patterson property and imprisoning family members. But Anna Miller's revelation came too late to prevent the next phase of the conspiracy. On the first Sunday in April, as the valley's Protestant families gathered for morning worship at Millbrook Presbyterian Church, Reverend Jonathan Hayes delivered a sermon that marked a dramatic departure from his usual message of Christian charity and community cooperation. Instead, he spoke of hidden enemies within their midst, of false friends who used righteousness as a mask for wickedness, and of the biblical obligation to root out corruption before it destroyed the faithful. The sermon's real impact became clear during the following week, when several Protestant families began reporting strange incidents involving their Catholic neighbors. Tools went missing from barns and were found days later in locations that suggested theft by specific individuals. Livestock fell ill after grazing in pastures adjacent to Catholic farms, leading to whispered accusations of deliberate poisoning. Most seriously, money disappeared from collection plates and church funds, with suspicion falling on the Catholic families who attended joint community events. These incidents followed a pattern that was too precise to be coincidental. Each episode provided just enough evidence to suggest guilt without offering definitive proof, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned relationships between families who had lived peacefully together for generations. The timing was also carefully orchestrated to build toward a climactic confrontation during the Easter season, when religious emotions ran highest and the community's attention was focused on matters of sin and redemption. Duncan Patterson found himself caught in the middle of this deteriorating situation. His engagement to Sarah McKenna made him a target for those who wanted to exploit religious divisions, while his role in managing the family's underground railroad activities put him at risk from federal investigators. Anonymous threats appeared nailed to trees along roads he traveled regularly, warning him to abandon his wedding plans or face consequences that would extend to his entire family. The pressure intensified when Marshal Garrett began conducting night raids on suspected safe houses throughout the region. These operations, ostensibly designed to capture fugitive slaves, seemed designed more to terrorize the local population than to enforce federal law. The marshals would surround farmhouses in the pre-dawn darkness, demand entry without warrants, and conduct thorough searches that left properties damaged and families traumatized. The raid on the McKenna farm proved particularly devastating. The marshals arrived at midnight, claiming to have received reports of suspicious activity. They searched every building on the property, questioned family members for hours, and confiscated personal papers and correspondence. While they found no evidence of Underground Railroad involvement, they discovered what they claimed were inflammatory political materials that suggested seditious attitudes toward federal authority. Patrick McKenna, Sarah's father, was arrested on charges of harboring fugitive slaves and inciting resistance to federal law. The evidence against him consisted entirely of perfectly legal political pamphlets and a collection of letters from relatives in Ireland that marshals interpreted as communications with foreign conspirators. Despite the weakness of the case, McKenna was transported to a federal jail in Pittsburgh to await trial, leaving his family both leaderless and financially desperate. The arrest sent shock waves through the valley's Irish Catholic population, demonstrating that federal authorities were willing to use the flimsiest pretexts to target anyone who challenged the existing social order. Families began destroying political materials, canceling subscriptions to abolitionist newspapers, and avoiding any activities that might attract official attention. The atmosphere of fear created exactly the conditions that Jeremiah Blackwood had been seeking to exploit. Eleanor Patterson recognized the systematic nature of the campaign against her family and their allies. The timing of Father O'Sullivan's death, the arrival of hostile federal marshals, the orchestrated incidents between Protestant and Catholic families, and now the arrest of Duncan's future father-in-law followed a logical progression that could only have been planned by someone with detailed knowledge of local conditions and substantial resources to implement a complex strategy. She began conducting her own investigation, using her extensive network of social contacts to gather information about the conspiracy's true architects. What she discovered was a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond Millbrook Valley, involving political operatives from multiple states who specialized in manufacturing the kind of religious and ethnic conflicts that could justify federal intervention in local affairs. The evidence Eleanor assembled painted a picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Marshal Garrett had a documented history of accepting bribes from slave owners and political organizations, while his deputy Finn had been dismissed from previous positions for excessive brutality and evidence tampering. The two men were essentially mercenaries who sold their federal authority to whoever offered the highest payment. But Eleanor's investigation also revealed the local dimension of the conspiracy. Jeremiah Blackwood had been corresponding with federal officials for months, providing detailed intelligence about Underground Railroad operations and identifying specific individuals who could be targeted for arrest. He had also been cultivating relationships with disaffected valley residents, offering financial incentives for information about their neighbors' activities and political beliefs. The scope of Blackwood's network was staggering. It included the innkeeper who provided information about travelers, the postmaster who monitored correspondence, several farmers whose economic desperation made them vulnerable to bribery, and even some church members who had been convinced that exposing the Patterson family's activities was a religious duty. The conspiracy had transformed a significant portion of the valley's population into informants and collaborators. As April progressed toward the planned May wedding between Duncan Patterson and Sarah McKenna, the pressure on both families reached a breaking point. Federal marshals continued their harassment, conducting additional raids and making thinly veiled threats about what would happen to anyone who interfered with their investigations. Jeremiah Blackwood's allies spread increasingly wild rumors about Patterson family activities, claiming they were operating a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Underground Railroad. The situation exploded into open conflict when young Margaret Patterson, Malcolm's 12-year-old daughter, disappeared while walking home from school on a warm afternoon in late April. The girl's books and lunch pail were found beside Clearwater Creek, but there was no sign of struggle and no witnesses to her disappearance. Search parties scoured the valley for 3 days without finding any trace of the child. Then, on the 4th day, Margaret reappeared at the family estate, apparently unharmed but unable or unwilling to explain where she had been. The girl seemed traumatized by her experience, speaking in whispers and starting at unexpected sounds. When pressed for details about her disappearance, she would only say that kind people had taken care of her and that she had been warned not to talk about what she had seen. But Margaret's return brought a message that terrified the entire Patterson family. Hidden in the pocket of her dress was a note written in educated hand, promising that the child's disappearance was merely a demonstration of what could be accomplished by those who had been watching the family's activities. Future incidents, the message warned, might not end so fortunately unless certain Underground Railroad operations ceased immediately and permanently. The kidnapping of Margaret Patterson marked the point at which a campaign of intimidation and legal harassment transformed into something far more sinister and personal. Someone had crossed the line from political opposition to criminal violence, demonstrating both the ability and the willingness to target innocent family members in pursuit of their larger goals. The gloves had come off, and the final phase of the conspiracy was about to begin. Eleanor Patterson refused to accept that her daughter's kidnapping was merely a warning shot in an escalating conflict. The meticulous planning behind the girls' disappearance and safe return suggested a level of organization that went far beyond simple intimidation tactics. Someone had orchestrated Margaret's abduction with surgical precision, timing it to maximize psychological impact while avoiding the kind of permanent harm that might provoke federal intervention from authorities not already compromised by corruption. Recognizing that local law enforcement had been either bought or intimidated into silence, Eleanor began assembling her own intelligence network. She started with the valley's most overlooked residents, the domestic servants, seamstresses, and laborers who moved through the community like ghosts, invisible to those who employed them but perfectly positioned to observe conversations and activities that their employers assumed remained private. Anna Mueller, the German seamstress who had overheard the federal marshals discussing their true mission, became Eleanor's primary collaborator in this clandestine investigation. Anna's work took her into homes throughout the valley, providing legitimate reasons to visit both Protestant and Catholic families, while gathering information about the conspiracy's local operatives. Her foreign accent and humble social status made her seem harmless to those who might otherwise guard their tongues around potential informants. Through Anna's carefully cultivated network, Eleanor learned that the campaign against her family involved far more local residents than she had initially suspected. The conspiracy extended beyond obvious antagonists like Jeremiah Blackwood to include respected community members who had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives, religious manipulation, and carefully crafted appeals to ethnic prejudice. Dr. Harrison Wells, who had served the valley's medical needs for over 20 years, had been providing detailed reports about the health and activities of Catholic families to federal authorities. The doctor's privileged access to homes during illness allowed him to observe family dynamics, financial circumstances, and political attitudes that other informants couldn't assess. His medical bag had become a cover for espionage activities that violated every principle of patient confidentiality and professional ethics. Even more shocking was the involvement of schoolmaster Benjamin Foster, whose position gave him unique insight into the beliefs and backgrounds of Valley children. Foster had been systematically questioning students about their families' political views, their visitors, and their domestic routines. He compiled detailed profiles of household activities, identifying families who might be involved in Underground Railroad operations, based on patterns of unusual nighttime activity or unexplained guests. The conspiracy's most insidious aspect was its exploitation of genuine religious devotion for political purposes. Reverend Jonathan Hayes, whose inflammatory sermons had helped poison relationships between Protestant and Catholic families, had been receiving regular payments from Jeremiah Blackwood, disguised as donations for church building funds. The minister's transformation from an advocate of Christian charity to a promoter of sectarian suspicion hadn't occurred naturally, but had been carefully orchestrated through financial pressure and ideological manipulation. Eleanor's investigation revealed that the conspiracy operated through multiple layers of recruitment and control. At the top level, Jeremiah Blackwood coordinated with external political operatives and federal officials who provided legal cover for harassment campaigns. The middle tier consisted of local collaborators like Dr. Wells and Schoolmaster Foster, who used their professional positions to gather intelligence and spread propaganda. The bottom layer included desperate farmers and struggling families who had been recruited as informants through a combination of economic coercion and religious manipulation. The sophistication of this network became apparent when Eleanor attempted to trace the financial flows that sustained the conspiracy. Money moved through the community in carefully disguised transactions that appeared to be legitimate business dealings, but actually represented payments for services rendered to the anti-Patterson campaign. Church donations, medical fees, and even grocery purchases at Thomas Patterson's general store had been manipulated to create untraceable channels for distributing bribes and incentives to local collaborators. Anna Muller's position as a seamstress provided unique opportunities to observe these financial transactions. While mending clothes and adjusting garments, she noticed that certain families had suddenly acquired expensive items that seemed inconsistent with their known income levels. New furniture appeared in modest farmhouses, children wore shoes that cost more than their fathers earned in a month, and wives sported jewelry that suggested access to resources far beyond their husbands' agricultural earnings. The pattern was consistent across multiple households that had been providing information about their neighbors to federal authorities. Economic desperation had made these families vulnerable to recruitment, but the payments they received came with strings attached that gradually drew them deeper into the conspiracy. What began as simple information sharing evolved into active participation in evidence planting, witness intimidation, and the kind of systematic harassment that had driven Patrick McKenna into federal custody. Eleanor's most disturbing discovery involved the fate of families who had attempted to resist recruitment into the conspiracy's network. The O'Briens, an Irish family who had refused to provide information about Underground Railroad activities, had suffered a series of mysterious misfortunes that destroyed their livelihood and forced them to abandon their farm. Their livestock had died from unexplained illnesses, their crops had failed despite favorable weather conditions, and their credit had been mysteriously canceled by merchants who had previously been happy to extend payment terms. Similar patterns of systematic destruction had befallen other families who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for the campaign against the Pattersons. The Kellys had lost their tenant farming arrangement when their landlord suddenly claimed they had violated lease terms that had never been enforced previously. The Murphys had been accused of stealing tools from a Protestant neighbor, leading to social ostracism that made it impossible for them to find work in the valley. These economic warfare tactics demonstrated that the conspiracy possessed both the intelligence network necessary to identify potential resistors and the financial resources needed to orchestrate their destruction through seemingly legitimate business decisions. The message was clear to anyone who might consider supporting the Patterson family or challenging the federal investigation. Cooperation would be rewarded, but resistance would result in complete economic and social annihilation. The conspiracy's psychological warfare capabilities were equally sophisticated. Margaret Patterson's kidnapping had been designed not just to terrorize her family, but to demonstrate the conspirators' ability to penetrate what should have been secure domestic spaces. If they could snatch a 12-year-old girl from a well-traveled road in broad daylight and return her unharmed, they could presumably eliminate anyone who posed a serious threat to their operations. Eleanor realized that her own investigation was almost certainly being monitored by the same network that had identified and neutralized other potential threats to the conspiracy. Her meetings with Anna Mueller, her conversations with domestic servants, and her attempts to document financial transactions had probably been observed and reported to Jeremiah Blackwood and his federal allies. The knowledge that she was likely walking into a trap didn't deter her from continuing the investigation, but it did force her to develop more sophisticated methods of intelligence gathering and communication. Working through intermediaries and coded messages, Eleanor began reaching out to potential allies outside Millbrook Valley. Her correspondence with abolitionists in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh revealed that similar campaigns were being waged against Underground Railroad operators throughout Pennsylvania. The pattern was consistent. Corrupt federal officials would partner with local political interests to manufacture evidence of serious crimes, then use confiscation proceedings to transfer property from targeted families to collaborators who had assisted in their destruction. The scope of this coordinated assault on abolitionist networks suggested that Eleanor was confronting not just a local conspiracy, but a systematic campaign organized at the national level. Pro-slavery political interests had apparently concluded that the Underground Railroad posed such a serious threat to their economic system that it justified unprecedented cooperation between federal law enforcement and local criminal networks. This realization led Eleanor to a terrifying conclusion about her family's situation. The Pattersons weren't just facing harassment from jealous neighbors or even corrupt federal marshals. They had been targeted for destruction by a conspiracy that possessed virtually unlimited resources and had already demonstrated its willingness to use kidnapping, economic warfare, and systematic intimidation to achieve its goals. The evidence Eleanor had assembled painted a picture of her family's enemies that was both more extensive and more dangerous than anything she had initially imagined. But it also revealed potential vulnerabilities in the conspiracy's operations. The network's size and complexity created opportunities for infiltration and sabotage, while its dependence on secrecy made it vulnerable to exposure if the right evidence could be assembled and presented to honest authorities. As Eleanor prepared to take her investigation to its next level, she understood that she was entering the most dangerous phase of a conflict that had already claimed the life of Father O'Sullivan and destroyed multiple families who had dared to resist. The conspiracy had demonstrated both its reach and its ruthlessness, but it had also revealed its methods and its membership. The question now was whether Eleanor could expose the truth before the conspiracy completed its ultimate goal of eliminating the Patterson family entirely. The wedding of Duncan Patterson and Sarah McKenna, scheduled for the third Sunday in May, had become the focal point around which all the conspiracy's various threads were converging. The ceremony would bring together the valley's Protestant and Catholic communities in a celebration that directly challenged the religious divisions the conspirators had worked so hard to create. More importantly, it would unite two families whose combined resources and influence could potentially resist the kind of systematic intimidation that had proven so effective against isolated households. Eleanor suspected that the conspiracy would use the wedding as an opportunity to stage some kind of dramatic incident that would justify massive federal intervention in the valley. The gathering of so many people in one location would provide cover for the kind of false flag operation that could transform a celebration into a tragedy, giving corrupt officials the pretext they needed to declare martial law and seize Patterson property as a security measure. Eleanor Patterson made her decision on the eve of her son's wedding. Armed with months of painstaking investigation and a collection of evidence that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy against her family, she requested a private meeting with Federal Marshal William Garrett. The meeting would take place at dawn in the neutral ground of Millbrook Presbyterian Church, with Reverend Hayes serving as witness to whatever agreements might be reached. The pre-dawn darkness of May 20th, 1857 found Eleanor walking alone through the valley she had called home for 25 years, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents capable of destroying the careers and reputations of dozens of prominent men. She understood that she was likely walking into a trap, but the alternative was watching her family be systematically destroyed by enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. Marshal Garrett was waiting for her in the church sanctuary, his bulk silhouetted against the pale light filtering through stained glass windows donated by the Patterson family just 3 years earlier. Deputy Marshal Finn stood near the altar, his hand resting casually on his weapon in a gesture that was clearly intended to intimidate. Reverend Hayes occupied the front pew, his nervous fidgeting revealing his awareness that he was about to witness negotiations that would determine the fate of his entire community. Eleanor wasted no time on pleasantries. She opened her portfolio and began laying documents on the communion table, each paper representing another thread in the web of corruption that had ensnared Millbrook Valley. Financial records showing payments from Jeremiah Blackwood to federal officials, correspondence between local collaborators and outside political operatives, detailed accounts of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and the systematic harassment of families who had refused to participate in the conspiracy against her family. Marshal Garrett examined the documents with the careful attention of a man whose career and freedom depended on assessing their authenticity and potential impact. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and impossible to dismiss as the fabrications of a desperate woman. Eleanor had assembled a prosecutable case against dozens of individuals, including federal officials whose corruption reached far beyond their activities in Pennsylvania. The terms of Eleanor's proposal were straightforward. In exchange for the permanent destruction of these documents and her family's silence about the conspiracy they had uncovered, she demanded the immediate cessation of all federal harassment, the release of Patrick McKenna from federal custody, the withdrawal of Marshal Garrett and his deputy from the valley, and guaranteed safe passage for any families who wished to relocate to other states. Marshal Garrett's response was swift and predictable. He rejected Eleanor's terms entirely, pointing out that a woman who possessed evidence of federal crimes was herself guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to harbor fugitive slaves. Rather than negotiating for her family's freedom, Eleanor had walked into a trap that would justify their immediate arrest and the confiscation of all Patterson property as evidence of criminal enterprise. Deputy Marshal Finn produced a warrant for Eleanor's arrest that had been prepared in advance, complete with charges that perfectly matched the evidence she had just revealed. Her investigation into the conspiracy had been monitored from its beginning, And every document she had collected had been carefully cataloged by informants who reported her activities to Jeremiah Blackwood and his federal allies. But Eleanor had anticipated this possibility. As Marshal Garrett reached for the documents spread across the communion table, she calmly informed him that what he was examining were copies, not originals. The authentic documents had been deposited with trusted allies outside the valley, along with detailed instructions for their distribution to newspapers, political leaders, and honest federal officials if anything happened to the Patterson family. The revelation transformed the dynamics of the confrontation entirely. Marshal Garrett found himself facing not a desperate woman seeking to bargain for her family's safety, but a sophisticated opponent who had outmaneuvered him at every step. Eleanor had used his own surveillance network against him, feeding false information to his informants while conducting her real investigation through channels he hadn't detected. The dead priest Father O'Sullivan hadn't been a random victim, but a crucial element in Eleanor's counterintelligence operation. Before his death, the priest had helped establish secure communication channels with Catholic networks throughout Pennsylvania, creating a system for distributing evidence that couldn't be controlled by local authorities. His murder had been intended to prevent this network from functioning, but Eleanor had already transferred the necessary documents and established alternative distribution methods. Marshal Garrett's recognition that he had been outmaneuvered led to a desperate attempt to salvage his mission through direct action. If Eleanor Patterson couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence, she would have to be eliminated along with anyone else who possessed dangerous knowledge about the conspiracy. The wedding celebration scheduled for later that day would provide perfect cover for the kind of violent incident that could justify martial law and mass arrests. Eleanor understood that her successful confrontation with Marshal Garrett had escalated the conflict to its most dangerous level. The conspiracy's leaders would now abandon subtle methods in favor of direct violence, using the wedding as an opportunity to eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. Her family and their Catholic allies would face not just individual assassination attempts but a coordinated assault designed to eliminate all witnesses to the conspiracy's activities. The hours leading up to Duncan Patterson's wedding became a frantic race between Eleanor's attempts to warn potential victims and the conspiracy's preparations for mass violence. Using the communication network she had established through Anna Mueller and other trusted allies, Eleanor sent urgent messages to every family that had been targeted by the federal investigation, warning them to avoid the wedding celebration or risk becoming casualties in a planned massacre. But many families had already begun traveling to the Patterson estate for the ceremony, unaware that their participation in what should have been a joyous celebration would mark them for elimination by enemies who saw their existence as a threat to the established social order. The convergence of so many targeted individuals in one location created exactly the situation that Jeremiah Blackwood and his federal allies had been working to orchestrate for months. The wedding itself became a surreal mixture of celebration and preparation for siege. Duncan Patterson exchanged vows with Sarah McKenna in the garden behind the family mansion, surrounded by guests who understood they were participating in what might be their final act of defiance against the forces that sought to destroy their community. The ceremony proceeded with desperate normalcy, as if the simple act of completing the marriage ritual could somehow protect the participants from the violence that everyone sensed was approaching. Eleanor spent the wedding reception moving through the crowd of guests, quietly identifying escape routes and organizing defensive positions that might provide some protection if the expected attack materialized. The Patterson estate's layout provided certain tactical advantages, with stone walls and outbuildings that could serve as strongpoints, but the family's weapons consisted mainly of hunting rifles and farm tools that would be inadequate against the kind of professional violence that federal marshals could deploy. As evening approached and guests began preparing to return to their homes throughout the valley, the first signs of the planned assault became visible. Armed men who were clearly not local residents began appearing on roads leading to the Patterson estate, positioning themselves to prevent anyone from leaving the celebration. These weren't federal marshals or local militia members, but professional gunmen who had been imported specifically for this operation. The attack began at sunset with systematic arson designed to create panic and confusion among the wedding guests. Barns and outbuildings throughout the valley burst into flames simultaneously, suggesting coordination that could only have been achieved through careful planning and extensive local knowledge. The fires weren't random acts of violence, but strategic moves intended to draw potential defenders away from the main target while creating the appearance of widespread chaos. Duncan Patterson attempted to organize resistance among the wedding guests, but the systematic nature of the assault quickly overwhelmed any defensive measures the families could improvise. The professional gunmen surrounding the estate weren't interested in a fair fight, but in the efficient elimination of specific targets who had been identified through months of intelligence gathering. Malcolm Patterson fell during the first wave of the assault, cut down by sniper fire as he attempted to reach the defensive positions his wife had identified. His death signaled the beginning of a massacre that would continue throughout the night, as armed men systematically hunted down wedding guests who attempted to flee through the surrounding countryside. Eleanor Patterson's final act was an attempt to destroy the evidence that had brought this catastrophe upon her family and community. As flames engulfed the main house, she fought her way to the hidden room where copies of the conspiracy documents were stored, hoping to prevent their discovery by the men who were methodically executing everyone who had attended her son's wedding. She never reached the hidden room. Federal Deputy Marshal Joseph Finn cornered her in the mansion's main hallway, where he informed her that her investigation had been monitored from its beginning, and that every document she thought she had hidden had already been located and destroyed by the conspiracy's agents. Her months of careful work had been rendered meaningless by the same network of informants that had made her family's destruction inevitable. Eleanor Patterson died knowing that she had failed to save her family, her community, or even the evidence that might have exposed the truth about their destruction to future generations. The conspiracy that had brought professional killers to Millbrook Valley had succeeded in eliminating not just its primary targets, but anyone who might serve as witnesses to what had actually occurred on that blood-soaked evening in May 1857. By dawn on May 21st, the Patterson estate was a smoking ruin, and 17 members of the extended family had vanished without a trace. The official investigation that followed would conclude that the tragedy resulted from an Indian raid, despite the complete absence of evidence supporting that explanation and the obvious impossibility of Native Americans penetrating so deeply into settled Pennsylvania territory without detection. The surviving residents of Millbrook Valley understood exactly what had happened, but none were willing to challenge the official narrative that protected those responsible for the massacre. The conspiracy's demonstration of its willingness to use unlimited violence against anyone who threatened its interests had effectively silenced potential witnesses and ensured that the truth about the Patterson family's destruction would remain buried for more than a century and a half. The official silence that followed the Patterson family massacre lasted exactly 6 days. On May 27, 1857, Sheriff William Morrison filed a report with Pennsylvania state authorities describing the incident as a savage Indian attack that had claimed 17 lives and left the once prosperous estate a charred ruin. The report included testimony from multiple witnesses who swore they had seen painted warriors fleeing toward the mountains, carrying scalps and stolen goods as proof of their victory over defenseless settlers. The fabricated narrative was accepted without question by state officials, who had neither the resources nor the inclination to conduct an independent investigation into events in remote Millbrook Valley. Indian raids remained a plausible explanation for frontier violence, even in areas that hadn't seen actual Native American presence for decades. The story provided a simple, politically convenient explanation for a tragedy that might otherwise have raised uncomfortable questions about federal law enforcement methods and local political corruption. But the conspiracy's success in eliminating the Patterson family came at a cost that its architects had failed to anticipate. The systematic destruction of an entire extended family, along with their closest allies, sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania's abolitionist network that reverberated far beyond the boundaries of a single rural valley. Underground Railroad. Operators throughout the state recognized that the Patterson massacre represented a new level of violence in the conflict over slavery, one that threatened to transform political disagreement into genocidal warfare. Within weeks of the tragedy, detailed accounts of the true events began circulating among anti-slavery societies in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and New York. These reports, compiled from testimony by survivors who had witnessed the professional nature of the assault, exposed the official Indian raid explanation as an obvious fabrication. The systematic burning of buildings, the coordination of multiple attack groups, and the complete absence of any actual Native American involvement made it clear that the Patterson family had been eliminated by a well-organized conspiracy involving federal officials and local collaborators. Anna Mueller emerged as the primary witness to the conspiracy's methods and membership. The German seamstress had avoided the wedding celebration due to illness, but her months of intelligence gathering for Eleanor Patterson had provided her with comprehensive knowledge of the network that had orchestrated the family's destruction. Her testimony, carefully documented by Philadelphia abolitionists, revealed the names of local collaborators, the methods used to recruit informants, and the financial arrangements that had sustained the conspiracy throughout its months of operation. The exposure of Marshal William Garrett's corruption led to a federal investigation that ultimately revealed a nationwide pattern of abuse involving dozens of federal officials who had been accepting bribes from pro-slavery interests. The investigation, conducted by honest federal agents who had not been compromised by political corruption, documented systematic violations of constitutional rights, evidence tampering, and the use of federal authority to settle private disputes and eliminate political opponents. Jeremiah Blackwood faced a different kind of justice. His role in financing the conspiracy became public knowledge throughout Pennsylvania's anti-slavery community, making him a marked man whose safety depended entirely on maintaining the silence of collaborators who had participated in mass murder. The stress of living under constant threat of exposure took a severe toll on his health, and he died of what his physician described as nervous exhaustion less than 2 years after the Patterson massacre. The Blackwood estate, like the Patterson property, was eventually abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. But unlike the Patterson land, which became a kind of informal memorial to the victims of political violence, the Blackwood property was avoided by local residents who considered it cursed by the evil that had been planned within its walls. Hunters reported strange sounds emanating from the ruins, and travelers claimed to see lights moving through the empty windows on moonless nights. Dr. Harrison Wells and schoolmaster Benjamin Foster, the professional men who had betrayed their community's trust by serving as informants for the conspiracy, found themselves unable to continue practicing their trades in Pennsylvania. Wells lost his medical license after an investigation revealed his violations of patient confidentiality, while Foster was dismissed from his teaching position when parents learned of his systematic questioning of their children about family political activities. Both men eventually fled to Western territories where their past involvement in the Patterson conspiracy was unknown, but neither was able to rebuild the professional success they had enjoyed before becoming instruments of political persecution. Wells died in poverty in a Colorado mining camp, while Foster ended his days as a barely literate clerk in a California frontier town, his education and refined speech serving as painful reminders of the respectability he had sacrificed for Jeremiah. Blackwood's gold. The broader impact of the Patterson massacre extended far beyond the punishment of individual conspirators. The systematic nature of the violence convinced many moderate Pennsylvania residents that the conflict over slavery had reached a point where compromise was no longer possible. Families who had previously avoided political involvement began contributing to anti-slavery causes, while others who had supported gradual emancipation concluded that immediate abolition was necessary to prevent further atrocities. The Underground Railroad network, rather than being destroyed by the campaign of intimidation that had eliminated the Patterson family, actually expanded in response to the tragedy. New safe houses were established throughout Pennsylvania by families who understood that their own safety depended on the success of the broader struggle against slavery. The conspiracy's demonstration that federal authority could be purchased by private interests convinced many previously law-abiding citizens that they had a moral obligation to resist unjust federal laws. This transformation of moderate opinion represented the conspiracy's greatest strategic failure. By escalating political disagreement to the level of mass murder, Jeremiah Blackwood and his allies had inadvertently created martyrs whose deaths inspired far more resistance to slavery than the living Patterson family had ever generated. The Underground Railroad stations that replaced the Patterson estate were more numerous, better organized, and more carefully defended than anything that had existed before the massacre. The Catholic families who survived the Wedding Night Massacre faced a choice between remaining in a valley where their safety could never again be guaranteed or abandoning their homes to seek security elsewhere. Most chose to leave, selling their property at desperate prices to Protestant families who understood that the demographic changes would eliminate potential sources of future ethnic conflict. The McKenna family, devastated by Sarah's death and Patrick's continued imprisonment on fabricated federal charges, relocated to Ohio, where other Irish Catholic communities provided both protection and economic opportunities. The surviving O'Briens, Kellys, and Murphys scattered to different states, maintaining contact through letters but never again gathering in groups large enough to present the kind of unified presence that had made them vulnerable to systematic persecution. The Protestant families who remained in Millbrook Valley found themselves living in a community forever changed by the violence they had witnessed. Children who had grown up believing in the fundamental decency of their neighbors now understood that ordinary people could be transformed into accomplices to mass murder through the right combination of fear, greed, and ideological manipulation. The social trust that had made valley life possible was permanently shattered. Reverend Jonathan Hayes attempted to continue his ministry in the aftermath of the massacre, but his congregation dwindled as families either departed the valley or simply stopped attending services led by a man they knew had helped orchestrate their neighbor's destruction. His inflammatory sermons, which had seemed like righteous calls for moral purity before the tragedy, now sounded like incitement to violence that had already claimed 17 lives. The Reverend's final sermon, delivered to a nearly empty sanctuary in the autumn of 1857, was a rambling confession that revealed the extent of his complicity in the conspiracy and his growing understanding of the consequences of his actions. He spoke of the gold that Jeremiah Blackwood had used to purchase his cooperation, the lies he had told from the pulpit to inflame religious hatred, and the innocent blood that stained his hands as surely as if he had personally wielded the weapons that killed the Patterson family. Hayes disappeared from the valley shortly after delivering this confession, leaving behind only a note indicating his intention to seek redemption through service to those he had helped persecute. Some reports placed him among the missionaries working with freed slaves in the aftermath of the Civil War, while others claimed he had joined a monastic community, where he spent his remaining years in silent penance for his role in the massacre. The physical traces of the Patterson family's presence in Millbrook Valley gradually disappeared as buildings collapsed and vegetation reclaimed cleared land. The mansion's stone foundations remained visible for decades, but eventually they too were obscured by forest growth that transformed the former estate into an apparently pristine wilderness. Only the most careful observers could detect the geometric Patterns of old field boundaries or the unnatural straightness of what had once been carriage roads. The hidden room in the Millbrook Presbyterian Church, where crucial documents had been concealed during Eleanor Patterson's investigation, was eventually discovered during renovation work in 1932. The papers found there, preserved by the dry conditions and careful wrapping in oilcloth, provided historians with detailed evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed the Patterson family and confirmed Anna Mueller's testimony about the scope of the network involved. These documents revealed that the Patterson massacre was part of a systematic campaign designed to eliminate underground railroad operations throughout Pennsylvania. Similar conspiracies had been organized in other states, though none had resulted in violence on the scale of what occurred in Millbrook Valley. The evidence suggested that pro-slavery interests had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and neutralizing abolitionist networks, using federal authority as a weapon against American citizens whose only crime was opposing human bondage. The discovery of these documents in 1932 provided final confirmation of what survivors of the massacre had always known but had been unable to prove. The Patterson family had been murdered not by savage Indians, but by their own neighbors, acting in coordination with corrupt federal officials who had sold their authority to the highest bidder. The truth that had been buried for 75 years finally emerged into the light, vindicating those who had refused to accept the official narrative despite the personal costs of their skepticism. Modern visitors to Millbrook Valley find little evidence of the events that transformed a peaceful agricultural community into the site of one of the 19th century's most brutal political massacres. The valley has been largely depopulated since the 1950s when improved transportation made remote farming communities economically unviable. Most of the farmhouses stand empty, their windows broken, and their roofs slowly collapsing under the weight of Pennsylvania winters. But the landscape itself retains traces of the violence that once consumed this quiet valley. Local historians have identified the locations of buildings that were burned during the systematic arson campaign that preceded the Patterson massacre, and careful observers can still detect the geometric patterns of the old estate's formal gardens beneath decades of forest growth. The Patterson family cemetery, located on a hillside overlooking what had once been their prosperous farm, remains the most visible reminder of the tragedy that befell this community. The weathered headstones bear witness to lives cut short by political violence, their inscriptions serving as memorials to Americans who died defending principles that their nation claimed to embrace, but was not yet ready to protect. The true legacy of the Patterson family massacre lies not in the physical traces of their destroyed estate, but in the demonstration of how quickly civilized society can collapse when fear and hatred are systematically exploited by those who understand the darker impulses of human nature. The conspiracy that destroyed 17 innocent people succeeded because ordinary citizens were willing to believe that their neighbors posed existential threats that justified extraordinary measures. The methods used to eliminate the Patterson family manufactured evidence, corrupted institutions, weaponized religious sentiment, and the transformation of community members into informants represent techniques that have been employed throughout American history whenever established interests feel threatened by social change. The specific issue of slavery that motivated the Millbrook Valley conspiracy has been resolved, but the underlying human capacity for turning neighbor against neighbor in service of political goals remains as dangerous today as it was in 1857. The documents hidden in Millbrook Presbyterian Church for 75 years remind us that truth has a persistence that outlasts those who try to bury it, but only when individuals have the courage to preserve evidence and testimony. Despite personal risks, Anna Mueller's willingness to document the conspiracy's methods and Eleanor Patterson's systematic investigation of her family's enemies ensured that future generations would have access to an accurate account of events that official authorities preferred to forget. The Patterson family's story ultimately serves as a warning about the fragility of the institutions and social bonds that make civilized life possible. Their destruction demonstrates that prosperity, respectability, and community standing provide no protection against systematic persecution when political winds shift and ordinary people decide that their fears justify extraordinary actions against their neighbors. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.